Give me a dozen healthy infants and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist. A doctor, a lawyer, and yes, even a beggar man and a thief. John Watson encapsulates in this quote the fundamental belief of behaviourists, which is we are moulded and shaped like Play-Doh by our environment. And we start off as sort of blank slates, as just a fresh pot of Play-Doh, and gradually our experiences mould and shape us. Today we're going to look at the learning theory and the learning approach, which is based on behaviourism. And behaviourism, as you might realise, is focused primarily on behaviour. So we need to know the learning approaches, the behaviourist approach, including classical conditioning and Pavlov's research, operant conditioning, types of reinforcement, and Skinner's research. And we'll look at those in a bit more detail in the guide notes. We'll go on to social learning next time, which is an element or a branch of learning theory, but we're going to focus just on classical and operant conditioning today. So the key figures in today's session are Ivan Pavlov over here, and then we have Albert Skinner here. And these two are really the founding fathers of conditioning as an explanation for learning. History and context then. Behaviourism arose out of dissatisfaction with the psychodynamic approach. So they didn't like the idea that you were investigating the unconscious, which was subjective and difficult to quantify, and they wanted a more scientific approach, something akin to chemistry. Pavlov himself was actually a physiologist, and he was interested in animal physiology. Watson published Psychology as a Behaviourist Views it in 1913, and he argues focus should be placed on observation and measurement. Thoughts and emotions should be completely disregarded because there is no objective way of measuring them. So what are the assumptions? The assumptions of the behaviourist approach are as follows: that the majority of all behaviour is learned from the environment. That it takes, if you have heard the nature-nurture debate, nature is your genes and your sort of internal, your epigenetics and things like that. Nurture is your environment. So it says that actually we're shaped more by the environment than we are by our genes. In fact, at the time, it disregarded the role of genetics in behaviour almost entirely. Behaviour is determined by the environment. What does that mean? If under exactly the same conditions we develop a cause and effect understanding, then that technically should be replicable. In other words, if I put my hand into a flame, the flame is in the environment. If I put my hand into a flame, that's the environment. And that environment determines my reaction to it, which will be to withdraw my hand. So we are constantly, our behaviour is constantly being determined by the environment. Only observable behaviour may be studied. The mind is largely ignored because we can't objectively investigate it. So those are the key four assumptions. Classical conditioning then. Classical conditioning arose out of the work of Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist. He was interested in animal physiology. He was looking at salivation. He developed this formula, which jot down now. It's a shorthand for what we're going to go through next. Okay. This is the setup that Ivan had. He had a dog secured in a harness so that the dog couldn't move about, a container of meat powder, a tube drilled directly into the dog's salivary glands, and an observation screen. He had a device to count the drops of saliva and a revolving drum for recording responses. So in this way, he could measure how much saliva was being excreted and generated when he presented the animal with food. Okay? He was not interested in behaviour, well, he was not interested in learning theory, he was not really interested in psychology directly, and it became an interest afterwards. So, one of the things that Pavlov found was that when the dog heard the footsteps of his lab assistant, the dog heard the footsteps of his lab assistant, he would begin to salivate. So he would salivate just before the food was presented. Pavlov reasoned that, although presentation of the food produces the unconditioned response of salivation, an unlearned relationship, over time, the dog learned to associate the assistant's footsteps with the presentation of food, so much so that he anticipated being fed when he heard the footsteps alone, and began to salivate even though there was no food. In this way, the dog had learned an association between two conditions. So, classical conditioning. Pavlov decided to test his hypothesis. Before conditioning, Pavlov presented food and just checked that this actually produced an unconditioned response to salivation. It does. He then paired with the food a neutral stimulus. But he had to be sure that the neutral stimulus didn't cause any particular physiological effect. So he would ring the bell without food. The dog did not salivate. So he paired the bell and the food, presented it to the dog, and it would salivate at the food. However, if you paired it enough, what would happen eventually is if you brought the bell down without the bowl and rang it, the dog would salivate anyway. The dog had learned to associate bell with the consequence of eating, salivation. Classical conditioning. There are other important features that you need to know then. One is timing. The timing of the neutral stimulus being paired with the unconditioned stimulus matters. It must be immediately before or at the same time. You can't, for example, give the dog food and then a minute later ring a bell. It's not going to learn that way. So it has to be just before or at the same time. Extinction refers to a stimulus becoming extinct over time if the unconditioned stimulus is removed. So in this case, Pavlov rang the bell, and he rang the bell but didn't give the dog any food. Eventually the dog unlearned this behavior, what's referred to as extinction. Spontaneous recovery shows that any extinct behavior can be conditioned more swiftly next time because it's already been learned once, so the sort of foundations are there. And stimulus generalization is a very interesting concept. It refers to the idea that when Pavlov trained dogs to salivate at a tone, a monotone, his classical conditioning occurred. But he also found that salivation would occur when he produced different tones, high and low. This suggests that the dogs had learned to associate, yes, the tone, but had generalized that stimulus to a series of different things. And this explains why we might salivate, or a dog might salivate, at a variety of foods, even though they're technically different. Operant conditioning, Skinner. So operant conditioning was devised by Skinner, B.F. Skinner, and it consists of three elements: positive, negative, reinforcement, and punishment. Positive reinforcement is the one you're familiar with, when you're rewarded for a behavior so you repeat it. With rats, if they press a lever and receive a treat, they'll press that lever more often. Negative reinforcement means that when you have a negative stimuli, you feel, perhaps you are feeling really ill or sick, and something removes that negative experience, you'll do whatever it was that removed it. So for example, if you've got a headache and you take a paracetamol and it takes your headache away, you learn a relationship that take the paracetamol, it will take your headache away. And punishment. Behavior leading to punishment is less likely to be repeated. So here we're neutral. Positive reinforcement rewards us. Negative reinforcement, we're already miserable, but it takes whatever the action is, it takes that misery away and brings us back up. Punishment, we're neutral and makes us feel bad. How did Skinner investigate this? He used the Skinner box. The Skinner box consists of a lever, an electric grid, and a food pellet system. So what would happen was, the rat would be placed into the box, it would press the lever by accident the first few times, and that pressing the lever would produce a food pellet. The rat would eat the pellet, receive the pleasure, and repeat. Operant conditioning, The rat presses the lever and he receives a food pellet from this tube here. He eats the food pellet, he receives pleasure. He accidentally presses it again. Food pellet. Over time, the frequency of pressing the lever increases until we say learning has been established. And once that's happened, the rat will press the lever every time it wants food. Now, in negative reinforcement, very cleverly, Skinner would electrify the floor. And what would happen when the rat pressed the lever is, it would switch off the electricity. So it would remove a negative experience, which is referred to as negative reinforcement. The rat would learn to press the lever to remove the pain. In a third condition, here the punishment condition, Skinner rigged it so that every time the rat pressed the lever, it electrified the floor. The rat learned fairly swiftly not to press the lever. These three conditions show how Skinner's theory applies to learning: positive, negative reinforcement and punishment. Then and now, Skinner has gone from being one of the most influential scientists of his day to a figure whose methods are studied mostly in exam A-levels and degree undergraduate courses from a historical perspective. In the 50s and 60s, you couldn't swing a cat without hitting a Skinnerian. Now, people would not admit to being a behaviourist because it's largely been discredited as a full explanation for human behaviour. Still, elements of behaviourism are at work today though in prisons. They use the token economy, rewards and punishments in schools, animal training. They use it for some therapy like aversion therapy, and it's a key element involved in cognitive behavioural therapy. So, some more information about operant conditioning. Schedule reinforcement is important. Schedule of reinforcement means there are different ways you can do it. Every time the rat presses the lever, it gets food. That's called continuous reinforcement. However, the most effective was found by Skinner to be partial reinforcement. And that means that the rat presses the lever and perhaps every third time they would get a treat. This is more effective at maintaining learning, having this partial reinforcement. There are severe applications to this. Don't give you a sticker every time you do good work. Give it a little more randomly. Punishment decreases the chance of repeating a behaviour. Punishment can be positive, smacking a naughty child, or it can be negative, taking away privileges. Positive and negative do not refer to punishment being positive in the sense of it being good. It's about the behaviour is going to be positive. The behaviourist approach in key debates. So we've kind of mentioned this before, but the behaviourist approach is deterministic. It takes the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate, and it is reductionist. These three evaluation points could be your pure evaluation in an essay on this subject for a 12 marker. For a 16 marker, you would have to add in some more evaluation, perhaps comparing and contrasting it with another approach. What contributions has it made? Well, huge. Language acquisition. Children start off by making random babble sounds. The ones that sound most like words get praised and therefore they're repeated. Moral development, conditioned emotional responses such as feeling guilty and conscious, punishing children for doing wrong. Attraction, Byrne and Claw argue that relationships develop via rewards. So there are certain rewards we seek in relationships, and if they're fulfilled, our needs are fulfilled, then we're more likely to continue with that relationship. And abnormality, conditioning of phobias. That's mostly classical conditioning. Contributions to society. Treating phobias, systematic desensitization. Behaviour shaping for autism. Token economy for prisoners. So this is where prisoners are awarded tokens for good behaviour that they can then use in tuck shops. Remember, you have a token economy at play in your school right now. Animal training from circuses to guide dogs. Watson suggested using learning theory for child rearing. I mean, that's quite a controversial idea. And Skinner wrote Walden 2. Now, it's sort of a recipe for a perfect society built on behaviourist principles. So have a look at these and do some wider reading, especially on Walden 2. I found that fascinating because these might be useful evaluations in your essays. Here are the key evaluations that I'm going to give you then. So we have: it is a very scientific, objective and controlled approach. It is reductionist. It breaks down behaviour, it controls extraneous and confounding variables, and it establishes cause and effect between the IV and the DV. It offers a counter-argument to the nature side. So this idea that people are perhaps just born intrinsically evil or born immoral. This says, no, so much of it is actually how you are raised. And that's a good thing because you can change your environment. You can't change your genes. You certainly couldn't change them at the time. It's parsimonious in that it offers fairly simple and basic principles that can be used to explain very complex behaviour. Operant conditioning can explain in some ways love and romance, as well as pressing a lever and receiving a food pellet. Practical applications we've talked about, and some of the limitations we're going to talk about are overcome with social learning theory. Each of these would make a great PEE point. Remember, in a 12 marker you want about 3 of them, in a 16 marker you want about 5. Weaknesses: ethologists challenge behaviourism. They say that animals have a lot of innate learning and that animal studies can't really be generalised to humans. It also ignores the role of conscious thoughts and emotions, and you can throw Freud back in his face and say by ignoring the unconscious, they're actually ignoring a huge influence on behaviour. So that is behaviourism in a nutshell. The sort of question you get on this is describe and evaluate the behaviourist approach. What I would like you to do is come up with a plan for this question. You don't have to write it out fully, but come up with a plan for this question, and we'll check out your plan and we might start to write elements of it next lesson. As always, if you have any questions, you know where I am. If you would like to know more, Google is just one click away. My email is one click away. Please take advantage of that. But otherwise, thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you in class.